Station identification.
You're listening to Z-Talk Radio Network.
Operating frequency
on ztalkradio.com.
You're listening to The Mind's Eye Show on Z-Talk Radio. My guest for this installment of The Mind's Eye is Professor Bruce J. Maclennan. For more than 40 years, he's been a student of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and religion. Bruce has lectured around the world about his published work, which features the relationship between Neoplatonic spiritual practices, Jungian psychology, and neurotheology. We'll converse about his latest book, The Wisdom of Hypatia, Ancient Spiritual Practices for a More Meaningful Life. Hypatia was the most famous female spiritual teacher of ancient Alexandria. Her mix of classical philosophies that she taught to pagan Jews and Christians in the 4th century forms the very foundation of Western magic and mysticism as we know it today.
It's a pleasure to have you on The Mind's Eye tonight.
Oh, it's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
The pleasure's all mine. So let's just normally we start by giving the listeners a quick shot of background info about yourself. Bruce, please.
Okay, well, my formal training, I guess you would say, is in computer science. I do research in artificial intelligence and self-organizing systems and various forms of unconventional computation like quantum computation, which is all mostly irrelevant to this book I've written, The Wisdom of Hypatia. But because I study things like the mind and the relationship between the mind and the brain, I've had a interest in philosophy since I was in high school, really, and so I've also then, as a hobby essentially, and also as something of an adjunct to my professional work, I've studied philosophy, and in particular ancient Greek philosophy. So I took Latin in high school, like many people had done, and I also started studying ancient Greek when I was in college because I really felt an affinity for the ancient Greek civilization and wanted to be able to read it in the original language. And so those two interests, my professional work in artificial intelligence and the philosophy of the mind, have kind of proceeded in parallel with my hobby of studying philosophy, and in particular ancient Greek philosophy, although they've converged in recent years. I've found that they actually can contribute quite a bit to each other. So I have been writing online for, I don't know, probably about 25 years, and finally decided to pull some of this material together into a book that would help people to practice some of these ancient Mediterranean spiritual traditions because they're useful today. And that's really the goal.
Yeah, and before we talk about that, you really do seem to have some type of infatuation, I guess, so to speak, with the ancient Greek philosophy. What is it particularly that, I guess, attracts you to this culture and the Roman philosophy as well?
Well, it's sort of a cliche to say it's the foundation of Western culture, for better.
Cliche is true, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. That's right. So, I think we have a much broader understanding now that certainly the ancient Greeks didn't do it all alone. And also when I talk about Greek philosophy and Greek culture, especially at the time of Hypatia, this includes the whole Mediterranean. So it includes the Middle East and Persia and Egypt and even further east, because Alexander, already in the 4th century BCE, had gone into India. And so the cultural contacts between the East and the West were established at least 2,400 years ago, and arguably much further back than that. So, but we have, our lens is really focused on the Greeks, because in terms of our history, a lot of what we understand as Western culture either converged from all of these sources through the ancient Greeks and then again kind of diverged out from them. So I find a lot of value in studying Eastern spiritual practices, and and as I said, there are connections between them and the Western practices. Um, but I think it's important to understand, the roots of our own spiritual practices, especially those of us in the West, that we sometimes kind of feel like ours are sort of impoverished or maybe not as vibrant as those in the East. And if we look a little deeper, we find that in fact that there are these spiritual traditions that are very deeply connected with our Western culture, and in that sense, are kind of a more natural fit to us. So that's why I've been interested in exploring this, and of course, critically. I mean, it used to be, especially in the 18th and 19th century, that Greece was seen as sort of an ideal sort of culture, and anything that the scholars of the time didn't like, they talked about as some sort of Orientalism, some sort of invasion of an alien, irrational kind of idea. And now we have I think, a much more balanced perspective on this. That the Greeks themselves said they got their best ideas from other people, from the Persians or from the Egyptians, from the Chaldeans, and so forth. And we've understood now that that's much closer to the truth. So there's another kind of slogan that the Greeks only stole from the best. And
imitation is the highest form of flattery. So
exactly.
And I know I always steal my best work from other people. So
yeah, so there was a huge, very much like now, I think, with the internet. Of course, then it was more people traveling from place to place, merchants, but also traveling scholars and holy men. There was just an enormous ferment of ideas, and people were very willing to borrow whatever seemed like a good idea or a good practice from another culture, and then put their own spin on it. And that's really, if we look deep into the roots of Hypatia's philosophy, which is Platonism, that's very much what we find. It wasn't sort of this pristine thing that grew up in Athens. It was a combination of many ideas from many different cultures. And even from prehistoric sources.
So let's really get into your latest book, The Wisdom of Hypatia, Ancient Spiritual Practices for a More Meaningful Life. And doing a little research on it, there seems to be a few variations of her name, the two most common being Hypatia, and then the other one seem to be Hypatia. Tomato, whatever you want to say. Your official pronunciation sounds like Hypatia.
Yes, that Hypatia is the common English pronunciation, and in going from Greek, often through Latin, and then sometimes through some of the more modern languages into English, the pronunciation of a lot of ancient words has been changed. And so I tend to use the modern English pronunciation just because it's more recognizable. The ancient Greek pronunciation was probably something like Hypatia.
Yeah, that's the other variation that I heard.
So but if you say that, people don't know who you're talking about a lot of the time.
Well, why don't you give our listeners the basic premise of the book?
Well, the basic premise of the book is that Hypatia, along with other Platonic philosophers, taught a system of spiritual practices that were intended to help people to live better. And that meant, in part, just dealing with ordinary life in a better way. And this was really the goal of all ancient philosophy. I mean, we tend to think of philosophy as, kind of hair-splitting and sometimes, arguments about abstruse topics. But ancient philosophy was more like a spiritual practice where small groups of students would gather with a teacher, almost the modern connotations of a guru, and they would learn how to live their lives better. And it would be sort of some group interaction and some personal counseling and practices to help people to live their lives better. And this applies to virtually all of the ancient philosophies: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonic philosophy, and so forth. So many modern people have sort of a one-sided view of philosophy in general, and in particular ancient philosophy, that it was all about talking and arguing about things. So over the centuries, over many centuries, or even over millennia, ancient philosophers developed systems of practice, of meditation and contemplation and ritual that would help them to live their lives better. And so in this sense, again, it's very akin to Eastern spiritual traditions like Buddhism or Taoism or yoga. So in particular, the Platonic philosophy is directed not towards helping us simply to live better in the material world, but also it teaches practices to come in contact with what we could call the spiritual dimension. Now, exactly how you interpret this sort of depends on the religious context in which it's put. And I should say that Neoplatonism and Platonism in general, I guess I should explain those in a moment.
Yeah, we'll get into the philosophy aspect, the details of it in a little bit. Let's talk about the actual person, Hypatia. I'm big into history, probably not as much as you, but I am a little ashamed that this person never kind of came on my radar, and I know in going through education, she definitely never came up. So let's talk about her, because Hypatia had a really interesting life. And so fill in some of the major points for listeners in events that happened in Hypatia's life so they can feel like they know her before going into the philosophy aspect.
Sure. So Hypatia is perhaps, well, I think certainly the most important female philosopher of the ancient world. She died in 415 CE, that's AD, and she lived in ancient Alexandria, which was really just an enormously cosmopolitan city. There were pagans there, and Christians and Jews, and all sorts of other people from around the world coming to Alexandria. And her father was named Theon, and he was the head of the Museon. We often call it the museum now, but it was the Museon, a temple of the Muses, that had been established 700 years before. So this is a very long-standing institution, and it was essentially a research institution where scholars would come and study various subjects, including the sciences and the arts. And it was connected with the ancient Alexandrian library, which is supposed to have had over 700,000 volumes gathered from all around the world. And so Hypatia's father was probably the head of the Museon at that time. And she seems to have learned everything from him, or at least as far as we know, she did not travel outside of Alexandria. I should say there's not an enormous amount of historical information about Hypatia, and which is why many people have not heard of her. She also really didn't leave any writings to us. And of course, a lot of our study nowadays is focused on the writings that have survived from ancient times. And so if you didn't leave any writings, you were kind of out of the history books. But Hypatia was very highly regarded in Alexandria. She was a pagan philosopher, and she would give lectures and had private instruction for her students. She also worked on problems in mathematics and astronomy, aiding her father, Theon. And we do have some fragments of her astronomical work surviving. And she was considered an advisor to many of the most important people in Alexandria, in particular to Orestes, the governor of Alexandria at that time. And so we might not know much of her at all, except that her death features in a number of histories. And
yeah, she had a pretty sad end to her life, unfortunately.
She had a very sad end because there was a lot of competition in Alexandria at that time between Orestes, who was a Christian, and Cyril, who's now known as Saint Cyril, who was the bishop in Alexandria at that time. And as many of these things, it's very complicated, and it seems to be mostly political, and it was really about who was going to exert most control over Alexandria. But because Hypatia was an advisor to Orestes, Cyril viewed her as an enemy. And he seems to have been instrumental, at least, in stirring up a lot of resentment against her. They would call her that pagan woman, and they accused her of being a witch and of bewitching Orestes. They, of course, this is goes along with the views at the time. Part of what she was accused of was doing mathematics and using musical instruments and astronomical instruments like the astrolabe. Yeah, these were all considered kinds of witchcraft. The story goes that one day Bishop Cyril was traveling down one of the streets, and the roadway was kind of blocked because all of these people with their chariots and they were all kind of the wealthy people and young men of the city were gathered around this house. And he said to his somebody with him, he said, "Well, whose house is this?" And he says, "Oh, that's the house of that pagan philosopher Hypatia." And the story is that he got very jealous of her, and so he started stirring up all sorts of rumors against her. So at that time, he had this I think of it as a paramilitary force allied with him, the Parabolani. And these were sort of assistants, strongmen essentially, that when somebody needed moving, say a sick person needed moving to one of the hospitals or something, these strongmen could do it. But they were also kind of like Hitler's brown shirts. You know, if somebody needed roughing up or somebody's shop needed trashing,
they got their hands dirty, essentially.
That's right. So eventually this subsidiary or subordinate to Cyril named Peter the Reader, he's called, one day gathered all of the Parabolani together, and they headed off to Hypatia's house. And and this is mostly from church historians, by the way, is the reason we know quite a few details about Hypatia's death. This mob went to her house, and she happened to be returning from somewhere in her chariot at that time. And the story is that they dragged her out of the chariot, they stripped her clothing off, and they dragged her to a church in Alexandria, and they began to beat her and actually gouge away her skin. And the Greek word is actually ambiguous, so we're not sure. It was either oyster shells or ceramic roofing tiles that they were using, and we can't quite tell. And so different people, argue for the plausibility of one or the other. But something sharp, anyway. I
think it doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah, and they went on to say that while she was still twitching, they beat her eyes out. So it was a very brutal murder. And then they proceeded to drag her body through the streets until, again, the historians say her body parts were scattered all over Alexandria. And then they went later and gathered the parts and burned them, which was also considered kind of an insult. So that was the end of Hypatia, and it's because of this terrible and brutal end that she probably figures in the history books at all.
Yeah, a very sad end to her life for someone who brought so much to the culture. She was, I believe, the last librarian of the Library of Alexandria. She was an inventor. Like, we're going to talk about her philosophy in a few moments. She really brought so much, and it's just really sad to see someone who brings that much and just taken away. And almost on top of that, there seems to be a bit of a character assassination on top throughout history, a little bit.
Well, that's true. And although I should emphasize that she was highly respected both before and after her death, not only by pagans, but also by Jews, and especially by Christians, because we do have the writings of Synesius, one of her students who later became a Christian bishop. And all indications are she was highly respected in Alexandria by many people of all religions after her death as well. And there was enormous revulsion in Alexandria at the way she was killed, uh, but she was killed, and Cyril went on to become an important leader in the Christian Church. Some people will say that that was the end of classical civilization. Her murder sort of marks the end of classical civilization, or the end of classical philosophy. And if you want to sort of identify markers in history like that, I guess that's okay. But people did continue to do philosophy. The Platonic tradition continued in Alexandria, and also outside of Alexandria, in Athens and other places. And so it wasn't the end, but it certainly was a wake-up call to a lot of the pagans and a lot of the ancient philosophers.
So let's talk a little bit more about her philosophy. This, I guess, is a dangerous set of teachings, so to speak. Explain her philosophy.
Well, her philosophy is basically that the universe, that reality is divided into a number of planes, and the plane that we think of as the ordinary physical world is the lowest and, in some sense, the least important of these planes. And above them, there's a cosmic soul, or a world soul, that's coordinating everything that happens within the physical world. And even more importantly, above that, there's sort of a cosmic mind, which is where all of the eternal forms of things, the Platonic forms as we normally term them, reside. And this is also where the traditional pagan gods, Zeus and Athena and Apollo and Artemis and all of those, would be conceived as residing. And then, as the principal source and cause of all things in the universe, was something that the Platonists called the One, or sometimes they would call it the ineffable One, or the inexpressible One. The idea that this was the principle of unity in the entire universe, the principle that causes anything to be what it is. And so, as this ultimate principle of unity, it unifies all of the opposites. So it unifies good and evil, it unifies being and non-being, existence and non-existence. And so in this sense, it's inexpressible in words and can only be known by a kind of spiritual practice of an ascent to the One, a kind of, you could probably call it a kind of yoga of ascending from the ordinary material world to union with this first principle. But in intermediate to that, there's all sorts of rituals for contacting the gods and for contacting various sorts of intermediate spirits, for getting guidance and aid. And of course, these are some of the practices that the Christians in particular thought were akin to witchcraft or some sort of demon worship.
Well, it's competition to begin with. Nobody wants competition religiously, particularly them. And then if the person, a regular person, can contact the god, that takes away their power, doesn't it?
Absolutely, that's right. And really, the ancient philosophy, in particular Platonic philosophy, is based around the idea that these are practices you have to do, and they involve individual contact with divinity and individual spiritual development. So teachers are essential in leading you towards these goals and teaching you the practices and helping you when you get stuck. But ultimately, it's something you do yourself. And so on the one hand, this meant that the Platonic philosophy was very compatible with other religions, because you could be a Christian Platonist or a Jewish Platonist or a pagan Platonist, by and large. And but it did mean that you didn't need priests per se to be intermediates or mediators between you and the divine realm. The goal was to, don't tell me what the gods say, I'll go ask them myself.
taking out the middleman.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to not be the middleman when you're making...
Especially if it gives you power and money.
Exactly. So someone listening right now is saying, why should I really care about Hypatia's philosophy? Why is this ancient philosophy important and relevant today to somebody's life listening right now?
Well, as we've alluded to, the time when Hypatia died, 415 was her actual date of death, was a time of enormous ferment. Not all of it was good. The Christians murdered Hypatia. They also murdered a few of their own bishops in the same way. There was a lot of warfare. There were different, the Jews would drive the Christians out, and the Christians would drive the Jews out of the city, and they'd confiscate each other's property. So there was a whole lot of religious extremism, much like we see in the world today. And so I think it's important, first of all, that her philosophy has shown itself over the centuries. So we're talking now, even from Hypatia's time of 1600 years, has shown itself to be an enduring philosophy, which if you dig a little bit into Christianity or Judaism or Islam, you find this Neoplatonic philosophy that Hypatia was teaching. So this has been a spiritual thread in the heart of these dominant Western religions for a long time. And so I think what that shows is that it's kind of a common ground between all of these religions that are so, at least in their extreme forms, are so opposed to each other right now. The other reason is that in Hypatia's time, as in ours, people were seeking to find a way to reconcile various views of the universe in a way that would help them to live their lives. And I think that that's what many people are facing now. On the one hand, many people are disenchanted with the traditional religions. Church attendance is down almost everywhere. And most of the statistics indicate that people are not so interested in the traditional religious practices. As I said, we have a great deal of religious strife amongst various extremists and fundamentalists. And on the other hand, the primary alternative that the modern world presents us with is scientific materialism. And, it's very valuable. It certainly helps improve the quality of our life in material terms. And it even, I think, is a good way of answering many of the questions we have about the universe. But many people also find this inadequate or unsatisfying when dealing with the big questions of life. How should I live my life? What should my goals be? How should I deal with disappointments and tragedies, sickness and death? What goal should I pursue? Is there some purpose in life? All of these kinds of questions that many people face at some time or another in their life are not very well answered by scientific materialism. And so, but people are not finding their answers in the traditional religion. Many people are not finding their answers in the traditional religions either. And so Neoplatonism not only gives some answers to these questions, but it gives techniques by which you can go and, in effect, get the answers yourself. So again, you don't have to take someone else's word for it. You can come in contact with, in effect, the governing powers of the universe and of our minds, and help, which will help you to live with more understanding and better in harmony with the universe as a whole. And so it's a way of essentially having spiritual practices that are actually amazingly compatible with our current scientific understanding of the world. So we don't have to give up the scientific materialism, but yet we can have practices that help us to live in this world now and answer some of these questions and give us some guidance in our day-to-day living.
Kind of like a best of both worlds. I'll take that any day.
Yeah.
Because really, the truth is, both sides aren't like you said, they're not satisfactory to the level most people need. And the truth is that, they always want to make everything so black and white when really there's grays, and there's a mix between the two.
Absolutely. And I think, that what we see now with all sorts of alternative spiritualities, the New Age movement,
Right.
Also many people adopting Eastern practices, which I consider very valuable. But I think this is all a reflection of the fact that people are looking for some sort of source of spiritual meaning in their lives. And I think that, Platonism is, especially for Westerners, has been a source of this that most people have overlooked. And so that's really what I've tried to do in this book, is to try and make this accessible to modern people.
Yeah, make it something tangible, and that's what's really enjoyable about it. And we're going to get into some of the practices in a few minutes. But for those just joining right now, I'm on with Bruce J. Maclennan about his latest, Wisdom of Hypatia. And as a mathematician, scientist, philosopher, Hypatia really couldn't help but connect these schools of thought with her teaching. Specifically, how does her spiritual tradition relate to science?
Well, she one of her principal activities was to edit and develop new mathematical techniques in astronomy. So at this time, the sciences weren't so divided as they are now, and in particular, astronomy was considered really just a branch of mathematics. And in fact, astrology was often considered more or less identical to astronomy. And so people at that time, they wouldn't have said they were studying astronomy or chemistry or physics. They would have said they were doing natural philosophy. And so it was just one form of wisdom. It was wisdom about that lowest plane of reality, which the ancient philosophers understood that to really understand what goes on in the material world, you have to look to those higher planes, and in particular up to that plane that I call the cosmic mind, or the realm of forms. And this goes back to Pythagoras, who lived around the 6th century BCE. And he's commonly credited with introducing mathematics into the study of nature. The story is that he was the one that related the size of objects to the pitches they would produce when you struck them. So like, for instance, hitting a piece of metal. And later that was translated into relating the lengths of strings on a lyre, for example, to the pitches. So he discovered that if you shorten the string by a length, by a half, then it makes a pitch 1 octave higher. And if the ratio is 2 to 3, then they sound at the interval of a fifth, and so forth. And so the notion that the universe is governed by mathematical principles goes very far back, and it's at the roots of this Platonic philosophy, which drew a lot from Pythagoreanism. So, and I should probably, just to sort of orient your listeners in time, I said Pythagoras was around the 6th century BCE, Plato was around the 4th century BCE, and Hypatia is in the 4th century CE. So we're dealing with something like a 1,000 years of philosophy, and this is the documented historical philosophy, and it goes back much further, of course. So to them, it was very natural that if you wanted to understand what was going on in this world, you would look toward this realm of eternal forms, where they said, well, this world we're in, everything's in change, it's in flux, everything is coming to be or passing away. This, of course, applies to us as living beings, but to everything else in the world. Mountains wear down, glaciers melt, and so forth. So they said, how can we get some eternal principles of knowledge? And for this, we have to look in this realm of forms where everything is eternal, nothing is changing, and it's not all mathematical, but certainly the mathematical principles hold there. So, the argument would be, well, 2 plus 3 is 5. That's not something, that's going to get worn away a little bit each year. Triangles have 3 straight lines as their sides. Those are eternal facts. Even though any physical triangle we might make would be imperfect and would, over time, would decay in some way. So they were searching for eternal principles of knowledge, and they said to understand these, we have to go to this realm of the forms, which is at this level of the cosmic mind, which is where they also put the gods. So in terms of governing our lives, our psychological attributes were also understood to be rooted in this realm of what in modern Jungian psychology would call archetypes. The psychological archetypes are rooted in this realm of forms in the cosmic mind. So whether it was understanding the way the planets, as they viewed them, went around the Earth, or whether it was understanding physical change in the universe, or whether it was understanding the change in our minds and our bodies, they would say if we want to understand them in the most fundamental way, we need to understand how they emanate or are governed by these eternal principles in the realm of the mind. So,
and they would do that through mind and science. So and they figured that that's to really understand it, they had to have a real fundamental understanding of how math and science is in nature.
That's right. So, of course, that doesn't mean you need to be a mathematician to be a Neoplatonist or to be a Platonist. But
it doesn't hurt.
It doesn't. Well, it doesn't hurt. And it's kind of a joke in the philosophy of mathematics that philosophers of mathematics, I'm talking about modern philosophers, have tried to explain mathematical truth in all sorts of ways. But it's said that when a mathematician is actually doing work, they're a Platonist, because you have to believe that these mathematical objects you're studying are real, or there's just no point in the whole business. But I think for people that have math anxiety or don't know much mathematics, the important thing is just for them, if they think a little bit, and I have some practices in the book to do this, but if they think about something like just visualizing a mathematical triangle as opposed to a physical triangle, or thinking about things like the numbers, and like I said, 2 plus 3 equals 5, that will help them to understand that there can be non-material objects like numbers and geometric shapes like triangles, and that they can have eternal properties that never change. We say they have being as opposed to the becoming in this physical world. And that helps them to understand, okay, well, if this is true for the realm of mathematical objects, maybe there are other things too. So like the ancient Platonists would debate about what's the ideal form of justice or piety or moderation or courage. And because they would say, well, just like triangles, there must be some sort of eternal form that is the true nature of each of these concepts. And there's a lot of, even though, now this is there's another slogan that all philosophy is footnotes to Plato, and so this notion of what constitutes a universal, words like justice and courage and things like that, and it's been debated for thousands of years. But from a psychological standpoint, there's a lot of truth in the Platonic view. Most people have some sort of gut level understandings of anger and love and justice and good and bad and so forth. And in a sense, that's reflections of those Platonic forms. And so there's a lot of psychological validity to the Platonic philosophy that I think is important in terms when it comes to practicing this. Because again, the goal here is to practice the philosophy and to live a better life. And so we have to pay attention to human psychology and not just to all of the philosophical analysis.
Let's talk about some of the practices, make it more tangible for them. In your book is organized into 3 degrees of wisdom. Why do you have these 3 degrees of wisdom?
Well, partly it's practical, and it's an observation of contemporary practitioners. So the 3rd degree of wisdom, which is the degree that focuses on Hypatia's philosophy, involves various sort of ritual and spiritual practices. These really, there's a saying that you can't thrive in the spiritual world unless you already know how to thrive in the physical world. And if you look around, especially in the New Age community and in many sort of more experimental spiritual communities, you can find a lot of ungrounded people that have been doing advanced spiritual practices, but their ordinary mundane life is a mess. And so I think is not good. So really the first 2 degrees of wisdom are trying to give you practical tools to get your mundane life in better order. And it turns out they correspond with 2 other philosophies that were popular at the same time as Hypatia's philosophy. The first is Epicureanism. And when most people hear the word Epicurean, they think about gourmet eating and fancy dining and things like that. But the actual philosophy that Epicurus taught was quite different. It was more a philosophy of understanding what truly gives you pleasure in life, and focusing on those things, and in particular on satisfying them with moderation. So it really tries to teach a life in many ways of restraint, but at least of being more conscious of what you really need to be happy, what is not necessary for happiness, but may aid it, and things that in fact impede happiness. And for this I think is an important lesson right there for many people in our modern world, again, who may be doing quite well financially and materially, but still find their life unsatisfying. They could almost read the first degree of wisdom in the book, and if they practiced that diligently, they would be much happier. But it is a life that can help you to live more tranquilly by yourself or with friends, but it's not very effective if you want to change the world or help the world or have some sort of impact on the world. It's in fact, one of the mottos is live hidden. In other words, if you try and strive for some sort of prominence, you're probably going to be less happy. So it's limited. And I think of it as all of these ancient philosophies can be thought of as a kind of psychological cure, both a cure of the maladies of the soul and then caring for the soul, tending to it when it's cured. And in fact, the ancient Greek word for this, therapeia, is the word we get therapy from. And so it is kind of like a psychological therapy. So Epicureanism is only the first degree. The second degree corresponds to the philosophy of Stoicism. And in fact, Stoicism was a very popular philosophy throughout the ancient world, and Platonists generally expected that somebody would have already learned and understood and be practicing the Stoic philosophy before they came to Platonism. So in fact, it was sort of the natural preparation for a study of Platonic philosophy.
It was the foundation to really get into it.
Exactly. And so, if most people, if they know much about ancient Platonism, they may know it through the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor of the Roman Empire. So he was certainly involved. He wasn't a hermit living in a cave. He was very much involved in the real world, so to speak, faced with many challenges, and yet continued to practice Stoicism with some mixture of Platonism throughout his life. And I recommend the meditations for anyone who's interested in Stoic philosophy. And Stoic philosophy also has proved to be valuable in the modern world. There are several popular books out teaching Stoic philosophy as a way of thriving better in the world and also having an impact. And also, it's the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very popular and effective kind of therapy that's being used now. So, Stoicism has also proved itself to be a very useful way of life. And for anyone who, has sort of a superficial understanding, because we use Stoic as a common term, just like we use Epicurean, say, oh, he's a very Stoic person, or you have to adopt a Stoic attitude. I would encourage people to study it a little bit deeper. It's a much deeper and richer philosophy with I think, a lot of commonality to Buddhism. And I think a lot of people that are attracted to Buddhism might find Stoicism also attractive, and again discover that there's this very rich philosophy that's deeply connected with the Western culture. So I have these first two degrees of wisdom, which are roughly speaking Epicureanism and Stoicism, partly because it reflected the natural progression of students of Platonism in the ancient world, and partly because I think these philosophies help you to be well-grounded in this world, to think deeply about what's important to you, what's not important to you, to deal with what happens in life, the bad things, but also the good things in a more tranquil fashion, and to lay a solid foundation then for the more esoteric and the more advanced practices then that are taught in the third degree, which is the philosophy of Hypatia or Platonism.
It sounds like a great vehicle for someone to find peace when maybe something in their life isn't exactly right at the moment. It sounds like they can take these personal practices and really apply them to improve their life just on themselves by focusing on themselves and bettering themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you used a particular phrase in the book that I thought was pretty interesting. And what did you mean by an ascent to the divine?
Well, if you look at this, now I should say that all of these geometrical or physical pictures of planes of reality, for example, and so forth, of course, are just metaphors. But if we take the view that our ordinary physical world that we live in is the lowest plane of reality, and above this is the cosmic soul, and above that is the cosmic mind, and above that is the inexpressible one, then to approach towards this one is a process of ascent up through these levels of reality. Now again, this is a metaphor, and an equally good metaphor is a descent into the interior. So sort of the superficial self is our physical body. We can focus inwards towards our soul within our physical body, and we can focus within our soul to this a sort of mind which corresponds to the cosmic mind within that. And within that, there's an inner spark of divinity that various terms were used for. One of the ones I like is the inmost flower of the soul, is what some of the Platonists called it. And so you can use either metaphor, and there are practices that use either metaphor, so you can either view it as a process of concentrating in towards your innermost essence, or a process of ascending upwards through the spheres to the divine principles. So if we want to understand in effect, our destiny within the world, what is it we should be doing, and to get guidance, and from the Platonic view, this is coming down from above. So we want to make contact with those higher planes, and so various sorts of mental practices and ritual practices, which I teach in the book, are ways of raising up, usually plane by plane. So we start in our ordinary physical world, and we do some practices to focus on some aspect of materiality, and then the next stage is a kind of detachment from the physical world and a movement of the mind into the next level up, the cosmic soul. And then additional practices will then raise you up to the cosmic mind, and then the most advanced practices try to achieve union with the inexpressible one. So why do you do this? Well,
what's the goal of it? What's
well,
the
the
point?
goal is to first of all, the goal can be very, very pragmatic. So if you're thinking about, say, changing jobs, and you're saying, well, I've got maybe these two, or maybe I could continue what I'm doing now, which is okay, or there's this other opportunity which is kind of different, but it's kind of exciting, and you might wonder, which does one of these fit better with my destiny, or perhaps some third thing? So one thing you could do is to contact the divinities which you feel are governing your life. And so this was a Platonic idea that each of us is in the lineage of some divinity, some god or goddess. And that's sort of our patron god or goddess. And that doesn't mean that others are irrelevant to your life, but that might be sort of your first or your main point of contact. You might literally talk to this divinity and say, well, look, I've got these two opportunities, and can you give me some advice as to which would be fulfilling my destiny? And the notion would be, that doesn't necessarily mean it would be the best in material terms. It doesn't even mean it would be the easiest choice. But it might be the choice that is most harmonious with my inner nature, my true nature, which is reflected in this lineage descending from this particular god or goddess. And so they might, give you straightforward advice. They might give you some ways of thinking about it. They might give you some signs to look for, or they could say something completely different. They might say, well, you're missing the whole point. What you should be focusing on right now is this other question. This is something that a lot of people, there's usually, especially I think in the Judeo-Christian traditions, there's a notion that the time when we can talk to divinities has long gone. Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God, but we don't anymore. And I think the spiritual practices of Platonism have always taught and showed us the way to maintain contact with the gods, and to get advice from them and to bargain with them, especially. So often when we find things are going badly in our life, the Platonic view, or the pagan Platonic view especially, would be it's because we're disrespecting or neglecting one of the gods. And so one thing you can do is contact that god and say, okay, you seem to be messing up my life. What's going on?
Blame it on somebody else, right?
Yeah, well, it's probably my fault, but give me some help here. What can I do to better honor you and respect you and pay attention to you? And the god might say, well, so-and-so, do so-and-so. And you might say, well, I'm sorry, but that's not going to work in my life. I live in the 21st century, and, I've got this job and these relationships, and I'm not, that's just not going to work. So you can negotiate with the gods and say, okay, let's find some mutually agreeable thing that, I acknowledge that, I've been ignoring you, and that's wrong, and therefore I need to fix that. But it's got to be something that is consistent with my context, the universe I'm living in, and my own morality, for example, or ethical standards. And so it's a negotiation like any other negotiation, goes back and forth, and perhaps over time you reach some agreement. Which you're kind of obliged then to fulfill. Or again, there's consequences, right?
Oh, aren't there always? Unfortunately, and unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left, and I think it's great that listeners can now have something tangible for a way to make their life more meaningful, something that you're giving them. And it's great that you have these practices, and I love the fact that they're ancient, that they can use it in something that this philosophy, it's not just in the mind, it's something tangible that you can actually do.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so there's lots of good academic works on Neoplatonism, and I've drawn from this material. But my book is practical. It's intended on helping you to live a neo or Platonic way of life.
And most writers, they normally have a few book ideas rattling in their brain at one time. You have anything up there right now? What can we expect from your next book?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm thinking about a couple different things. The ancient art of memory is a very interesting topic. It's used not just as a way of memorizing things like shopping lists, but it was a way of actually recrafting the structure of your mind. And so in the sense of spiritual practices, I think the ancient art of memory is something that's worth making accessible to more people. Again, there's a lot of scholarly work on it, but I don't know much that focuses on it as a way of mental or psychological development. So that's one thing. I'm also interested in some ancient divination practices, which can also be a way of essentially getting some psychological insights into issues in your life and what I think is very important, which is essentially discovering your destiny and then living your destiny too. But I've always got probably 50 ideas rattling around, and it's always which one am I going to work on next?
What's the one to focus on, right? And then you get into one, and then 2 months later you're going back to something else, and that's the way it works. And
yeah, and with the philosophy of Hypatia, it was one of those things I've been thinking about for years, and finally one day I decided, okay, I let's just do that.
You got to put it on paper. Sometimes you got to get it out of your brain, put it on paper.
Exactly.
And before we let you go, just tell our listeners where they can get a little more information about yourself and where they can get the book.
Okay, so the Wisdom of Hypatia is available, I believe, on all of the major online booksellers. It's published by Llewellyn, so you can find it at the Llewellyn website and order it directly from them. There's an ebook available, I'm told. I haven't actually downloaded it.
Well, I don't think you need it, right?
Yeah, no, I don't. And I have a website called wisdomofhypatia.com, and I've got a blog there, not too many blog entries so far, and I'm also going to be putting up some study material because there's some study groups are forming, and I've got some of that material prepared. And there's announcements about talks I'm giving and workshops and stuff like that. Let's see. Oh, and I plan to publish some short articles also in the Llewellyn Journal, which you can also get to from the Llewellyn website. So it should be quite easy to find the book, and I'm happy to answer questions and also to hear any sort of comments, positive or negative.
Hopefully we'll stick with positive.
Yeah.
And if you're going to have negative, don't curse in it, at least.
That's right. Try and keep them constructive.
Well, it has been a true pleasure. Bruce J. Maclennan, thank you so much for giving us a piece of your time.
Oh, my pleasure too. Thank you very much.
And thanks to Professor Bruce J. Maclennan for imparting us with the wisdom of Hypatia. Check out his book of the same name and visit the site wisdomofhypatia.com. HYPATIA, wisdomofhypatia.com. While you're at the professor's website, don't forget to check out ours, themindseyemedia.com. themindseyemedia.com. Join me again on the next episode in 2 weeks with Penn State professor Dr. Judith Newman as we dive into the deep crevices of U.S. history and discuss her book, Against Their Will, The Secret History of Medical Experimentation on Children in Cold War America. Keep listening in the next hour for Haunted Harvest Moon with Vonda from 7 to 8 p.m. I'm your host, Brian Turnof, and as always, I appreciate feeding your brain with the Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio.